Hey everyone, and welcome back to my series Start to Finish, where I show you the production of a track from start to finish. Today's going to be a downtempo track in a Chillhop style, with a laid-back hip-hop groove and some nice chords and synths. So let's jump into it. So the first thing I started with was some chords. I knew I wanted a nice mellow keyboard sound, and Logic has some really great electric keyboards. So I pulled up this patch and I just started playing. And I eventually landed on this, which is a really nice kind of jazzy chord progression. I really love the chorus and tremolo sounds on this keyboard patch. It should work perfectly for this track. So after getting that down, I knew I wanted to get my drum groove going as soon as possible. So I found this loop, which I thought worked really well. I often like using these drum grooves where it's not quite lined up with the grid, and it just has a nice flow to it. So getting that drum groove going early is kind of important because I want all the other parts that I do to line up nicely with that groove. This one had a really nice, mellow, laid-back feel that I knew would work well with this track. It also has very definitive drum hits, so I knew I'd be able to chop it up a bit and mix it up. And it would still sound natural and good. So the next thing I wanted to add was some kind of airy, synthy lead line. So I found this patch using the Serum plugin, which I love Serum. If you're looking for a really good synth plugin, Serum's great. This was essentially like a brass patch, but I turned down a lot of the highs on it to make it more mellow sounding, and I cranked up the reverb a little bit too. I also put some reverb on the track here that you can hear. I really like this sound a lot, and I often find that finding a preset that's close to what you want and then editing that preset is so much quicker than trying to create a sound from scratch. It's good to know how to create a sound from scratch so you know how synths work, but often that's just such a slow process that looking through presets and finding something that's close is so much faster. So up next was some piano. Again, Logic has great piano sounds too. So I pulled up the piano patch in Logic and I changed it to this upright sound. I also added some delay to it that you can hear. At this point I was just letting it record for a while and I was just playing as much stuff as possible. And I figured later I would decide what I was going to keep and what I was going to get rid of and how I was going to layer these. At this point I knew I needed something with some texture, either some type of noise or some type of synth that had a really airy, staticky noise to it. So I pulled up Serum again and looked through some patches and I found this really nice sounding patch. I really love the staticky sound of this patch. It works perfectly on this track. So at this point I was ready to hop over into Logic and start actually laying out the track. I had a lot of the ingredients for the track ready now and I needed to just get some basic form going so I had some idea of what else I needed to do. And I knew the first thing I needed to do was create some variations on this drum loop. I definitely didn't want that one drum loop playing for 2 or 3 minutes straight. That was just going to be monotonous. So here's the process I typically use to chop up drum loops in Logic. I'm using the quick sampler and I just drop the loop in and start chopping it up. Here I'm just playing the different chops on the keyboard and making sure they sound okay. And then from there I just start laying out the MIDI of the chops. And the first thing I'll do is actually just recreate the original drum loop. And then from there I can start making variations on it pretty quickly and easily. And you can see here I chopped it into quarter notes, even though the drum loop is playing like eighths and some sixteenths. But I find this is a really interesting way to create new drum patterns kind of quickly and easily, instead of chopping the loop into individual hits and then trying to recreate an entire new drum pattern from scratch. And here you can see how I'm kind of creating new patterns based on those MIDI notes. And it's pretty quick and easy just to try different things and mix it up. And then at that point I knew I wanted some additional percussion, and I found this ride pattern that sounded really great, so I added it here. Now here I did something kind of interesting. I knew this groove was a little bit off the grid and laid back, but the ride pattern was much closer to the grid, so what I did was add a sample delay just to push that ride pattern a little bit back in the groove. It's subtle, but it sits much nicer in the groove with just a little bit of a delay. And then also just cut out the lows from it too, which is a little sneak peek at the mixing that I'm doing. I tend to do a lot of the mixing as I'm producing, and I very often cut lows out of sounds, particularly anything that's not bass or kick. Of course, there's always exceptions to a rule like that. If you've got like a lovely grand piano sound and there's nothing else happening, I'm not going to cut the lows out of that. But typically in a production with a lot of tracks, I'm cutting out a lot of lows. The lows are often the hardest part of a mix, so getting the lows as clean as possible is really important. And somehow at this point, I still hadn't put any bass on this track, which is kind of wild to me. So I went ahead and grabbed my little mini Jaguar bass and plugged it in. And I just hit record and started playing and see what I would come up with. I like to just hit record and play for a while and see what happens. I figure I'll decide later what I'm going to keep and what I'm going to get rid of. And it's also helpful because you don't want to go back and record again, especially if the sound kind of changes a bit and you're trying to mix an older sound with a new sound. Maybe a knob on your instrument has changed a little bit, or something about the connection is different. I find it's better just to do all the recording right at once, if possible. And at this point I was pretty much done. I just did some editing on the bass part and then some mixing and mastering, and that was it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the process. Here's the final track. Enjoy.